Okay, let's dig into this. Europe is really ramping up its military spending. It's a pretty big deal.
Yeah, a huge deal. We're seeing talk of this massive plan, potentially $840 billion. Some are even calling it the Don't Mess with Europe plan, sort of unofficially.
Right, and the EU chief has been quite clear, hasn't she, saying Europe needs to take on, well, much more responsibility for its own security.
Exactly. Facing long-term challenges, as she put it, and also staying a reliable partner, especially for Ukraine.
The scale is just, wow, it really grabs you. This isn't just tinkering around the edges.
No, it feels like a fundamental rethink of Europe's defense posture, doesn't it?
Absolutely. And, for you listening, if you want to really understand what's going on here without getting buried in details, that's what this deep dive is for. We want to give you that solid grasp. Our main source today is a YouTube video, Europe Prepares for War, from Task and Purpose. It's a really good look at the history, the defense companies, even the nuclear side of things.
It really sets the stage well.
Whoa.
Because you need that history to understand why this is happening now. What are they actually preparing for?
Exactly. So our mission today is basically to unpack the why behind this buildup. We'll look at the surprising history, this idea of a European army.
Which has been around longer than you might think.
Right. We'll identify the key players in the defense industry, what they can actually do, and then think about the bigger strategic picture. Sound good?
Let's do it.
Okay, so this whole idea of European defense cooperation, it's not new. You might be surprised. The video points back to October 1950, just 5 years after World War II.
Yeah. France proposed a European army. Think about that. UK, Germany, Italy, working together on security so soon after. Well, after everything. It was radical.
Truly radical. And it wasn't just talk. In 1952, there was a formal proposal for the European Defense Community, the EDC.
And this EDC, it was different from NATO, wasn't it? It aimed for something more integrated.
Totally. It envisioned authority above the nations themselves. A common budget, shared weapons development, shared procurement.
The initial members being France, West Germany, Italy, and the Benelux countries,
Right.
Belgium, Netherlands, Luxembourg.
And a big driver, interestingly, was managing Germany, sort of easing West Germany back into the security picture without letting it just rebuild its own massive army right away.
Makes sense. Integrate them into a European structure. Plus, of course, the growing Soviet threat was a major factor, defending liberal values against authoritarianism.
And get this, it almost happened. They actually signed the treaty in May 1952.
Wow.
By 1954, even the UK was kind of on board, agreeing to common policies for training, tactics, logistics, standardizing equipment. The US was backing it too.
Imagine that. Multinational divisions, same uniforms.
But then, poof, it collapsed. 1954, France, the original proposer, didn't ratify its own treaty.
That's the twist, isn't it? Why?
Yeah.
The video suggests maybe Stalin's death in '53, the end of the Korean War.
Mm.
Perhaps the immediate pressure felt like it was easing off.
Could be. Maybe the perceived need for such a radical step just faded a bit.
So instead of a unified European force, we got West Germany joining NATO directly, rebuilding its national army, the Bundeswehr.
And European defense really became, well, mostly US-led through NATO for decades, less of that supranational European thing they envisioned.
But the idea didn't completely die, did it? People still talk about a European army today.
Yeah. Proponents argue, faster decisions with one leader, one stronger force, maybe more efficient procurement, like one main battle tank for everyone.
Simpler logistics, perhaps?
But as the video notes, it still seems really difficult. Politically, practically, national traditions, sovereignty concerns are still huge hurdles.
Which brings us kind of full circle to today's big push, this Rearm Europe plan.
Yeah.
It's not the 1950s EDC, but you can see echoes, can't you?
Definitely. Some of those core ideas, more cooperation, more standardization, maybe more joint funding, they're back on the table, even if a single army isn't the goal right now.
The focus now seems squarely on collective defense, making the existing structures work better together.
Right. Look at the EU's own defense review, hard-coordinated annual review of defense. Their priorities are things like better air defense, countering those kamikaze drones,
Electronic warfare, long-range artillery, ground vehicles, the modern toolkit, basically.
But then you have, like, the Vosberg blog, a German think tank mentioned in the video, suggesting maybe start with more achievable things.
Yeah, like a shared transport fleet, shared satellite intelligence, those strategic enablers that are super expensive for one country to manage alone.
So the EU chief isn't calling for the European army, but maybe some of its characteristics. A single market for arms makers, maybe?
Hmm.
Common standards, joint orders?
Funded by a single defense fund,
Yeah.
potentially.
Hmm.
She's been saying, the threat isn't hypothetical anymore. Europe needs to step up.
And it's not starting from zero. There's existing cooperation. The EU Battle Group, or EU Corps France and Germany, started that way back in '92.
Right, about 60,000 personnel from different countries. It's technically separate from NATO command.
The idea being it gives the EU options for autonomous action, less reliance on the US for certain missions.
We're also seeing things like the Nordic air forces, Norway, Denmark, Sweden, Finland, unifying their command. That's about 250 aircraft under one structure.
That's significant.
And just looking at the numbers overall, European NATO members combined, it's roughly 1.5 million personnel.
About 5,000 tanks, 6,000 infantry fighting vehicles, 6,000 artillery pieces, maybe 1,800 fighter jets, give or take.
Yeah, and comparing that to estimates for Russia, similar personnel numbers, maybe fewer tanks and IFVs, around 3,000 of each, maybe 800 fighters.
Of course, numbers aren't everything. Training, tech, readiness, lots of variables.
Absolutely. But it gives you a rough sense of the scale we're talking about, even before this new push.
Okay, but having the troops and the gear is one thing. Can the European defense industry actually produce enough, fast enough? That's a huge question the video tackles.
It really is. The industrial base. The EU chief mentioned 150 billion from this new fund should go to European companies specifically, boost the home team.
Especially for things like air defense and missiles, she said.
And you see this theme in think tank pieces too. Can Europe's industry surge? Can it fill gaps if, say, U.S. production shifts or supplies change?
So let's look at some of the key players the video highlights. BAE Systems, based in the UK. Big in ground vehicles.
Right. They designed the Bradley IFE, though that's made in the U.S. But in Europe, they make the CV90, often through joint ventures, like in Sweden. They've built over 1,000 already.
And they're investing heavily now, aren't they? Like $200 million mentioned in their latest report to expand capacity in new plants, even in buying countries.
Yeah, they built around 1,400 CV90s total, and they're adding a third welding line, hoping to get it running by 2026. The ambition is there.
Their president was quoted saying they want to multiply production by 4, then maybe 6 times, using new tech like welding robots, laser cutters.
It sounds like part of this bigger United Military-Industrial Complex strategy the video mentions, getting everyone pulling in the same direction.
Then there's Rheinmetall in Germany. Tanks, artillery, air defense. A real heavyweight.
Their potential is clear. Look at artillery shells. They're aiming for 1.1 million per year by 2027. That's a massive ramp up. Their stock price reflects that expectation too.
And they're building new factories. Hungary, even Ukraine, for tanks.
And combined with KMW across Maffei Wegmann, they can already produce over 200 tanks a year, plus around 200 Boxer IFVs annually from plants across Europe and Australia.
Okay, shifting gears. Thales in France, space systems, that seems crucial.
Absolutely. Reducing reliance on U.S. intelligence satellites. The U.S. has way more military satellites up there, like 246 versus maybe 49 for European NATO.
So building that European capability,
Yeah,
that's a long-term project.
definitely takes time.
Yes.
Then you've got Leonardo in Italy, known for helicopters, but now partnering with Turkey's Baykar on drones, a direct response to demand.
And Saab in Sweden, 100 years in the game. Submarines are big for them, especially for the Baltic. Also rocket launchers, missiles, the Gripen fighter jet.
Each fills a niche, and don't forget Airbus Multinational. They build the big transport planes, the A400M Atlas, and the A330 refueling tankers.
Essential for logistics, moving troops and gear quickly. Though the video does note some experts think Europe's existing logistics are actually pretty decent.
So the pieces are there, right? Different companies, different specialisms. The challenge is making them cooperate effectively. Integration.
Okay, let's talk manpower and the bigger strategic picture. After the Cold War, European armies shrank a lot.
Yeah. France suspended conscription, force sizes dropped maybe 40% across the board. But it shows the potential is there, right? They can generate manpower if needed.
The old NATO strategy relied heavily on the U.S. guarantee, didn't it? Small tripwire forces forward.
Like those battalions in the Baltics. Around 11,000 troops total in Lithuania, Estonia area, I think. The idea was attack them, you trigger a massive U.S. response.
But if that U.S. commitment seems less certain, then Europe suddenly needs a larger force of its own, ready to go, a bigger standing army.
Exactly. Though it doesn't look like Europe is trying to replace the U.S. strategic bomber fleet, for instance.
Yeah.
It seems more focused on the nuclear umbrella.
Which leads to the nuclear question. It's complex. Right now, the U.S. keeps about 100 B-61 nuclear bombs in Europe, right, at bases in 5 countries.
Yeah, Italy, Germany, Belgium, Netherlands, Turkey too, I believe. And those host nations' air forces trained to deliver those U.S. bombs if needed.
But what if the U.S. says no? What's the backup?
Well, Europe has 2 independent nuclear powers. France has around 290 warheads, fully independent production. The UK has about 225, works closely with the U.S., mostly submarine-launched.
France also has air-launched nukes. And there's been talk recently, hasn't there, in France about maybe extending their nuclear protection to the rest of Europe.
Yeah, but that would need a formal sharing agreement like the U.S. one, a big political step.
Okay, moving beyond just forces. What about logistics and defenses? The Kale publication mentioned Europe is investing in logistics, aiming to deploy forces fast.
Broader than a beer tent, anywhere within 24 hours, was the phrase used, I think. Developing new transport to potentially replace U.S. capacity there.
And then there's the idea of, well, building walls, fortifications, as an alternative or supplement to a huge army.
Poland and the Baltic states have asked the EU to fund a 700-kilometer east shield on the border with Russia and Belarus, costing billions.
You can see why, especially for the Baltics. Not much strategic depth, capitals close to the border.
Makes them vulnerable. So they're already building defenses, bunkers, fighting positions, those dragon's teeth tank obstacles. It's a big investment, over $650 million across the 3 states.
Estonia's former military chief had an interesting take: not stop the attack, but shape it. Use long-range weapons.
Meanwhile, Poland seems focused on buying lots of new kit tanks especially, using like 70% of its extra defense money on equipment to build mass quickly.
But the video raises a good point. You need people to operate all that new gear. Maybe more funding needs to go to recruitment and training, too.
That balance is always tricky. Hardware versus personnel.
So the big question hanging over all this, can Europe actually afford it? Is it economically feasible?
Well, the video cites estimates suggesting the EU might only need to spend an extra 1.5% of its combined GDP to essentially match the current U.S. military contribution to European security.
Which sounds manageable, maybe.
The European Commission itself, which proposes laws and manages the budget, thinks an extra $250 billion a year is needed to really counter Russia effectively.
That would push defense spending up from around 2% of GDP now to maybe 3.5%. That's a significant jump.
It is, but you have to look at the overall economic muscle. The EU's GDP is massive, around $17 trillion. Russia's is closer to $2 trillion.
And population difference, too. 450 million in the EU versus 145 million in Russia.
Yeah. So the capacity is there. The question is political will and finding the funds. They're looking at different sources. Maybe the UK cuts foreign aid, maybe special EU bonds, maybe unspent COVID funds.
The hope seems to be that member states won't block this increase, that there's enough consensus now.
Essentially, this Rearm Europe plan is about creating a grand strategy that everyone, or almost everyone, can get behind.
Okay, one last concept the video brings in. Operational art. Sounds kind of military jargony.
It is a bit, but it's important. It's basically the planning level between grand strategy, the big political goals, and tactics, how you fight battles. Theater level planning.
Connecting the dots to achieve the strategic aim came from Soviet doctrine, then the U.S. Army adopted it.
Right. And the video's conclusion is that what Europe is doing now shows a real shift in its own operational art thinking.
How so?
Moving away from forces designed mainly for interventions outside Europe towards preparing for potential conflict on the continent itself, as a way to deter that conflict from ever happening.
Preparing for the worst to prevent it. Makes sense.
That seems to be the logic, yeah.
Okay, so let's quickly recap the key takeaways from this deep dive. Europe's making a major investment in its military, driven by a changed security landscape.
This has historical roots, even echoes of that old European army idea, but the focus now is collective defense and industrial capacity.
Key companies like BAE, Rheinmetall, Thales are ramping up. The strategic thinking is evolving, considering manpower, nuclear issues, fortifications.
And economically, while challenging, it seems feasible given the EU's overall strength. It's about developing a new, widely supported grand strategy.
And this shift is reflected even in military doctrine, focusing more on continental defense as deterrence.
So for you listening, hopefully this gives you a much clearer picture of this really significant geopolitical development, what's driving it.
Absolutely. And it leaves us with a final thought, something for you to chew on. With Europe gearing up like this, investing so much in preparing for war, what does that mean long term?
For the U.S.-Europe relationship, for the global balance of power.
Right. Is deterrence the guaranteed outcome here, or does building up so much military might carry its own risks, maybe even increasing the chances of conflict down the line.
A crucial question with no easy answers.